Good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I want to apologize for Dean Galino that he is not able to be here this evening to introduce our speaker. My name is Frankel. I'm the chairman of the Chancellor's Committee on Public Lectures. I'm sorry. Is nothing here working? May I try again? Is it working now? No.
How's your voice?
Welcome to another in the My name is Frankel. I'm chairman of the Chancellor's Committee on Public Lectures, substituting for Dean Galino tonight and introducing the speaker. Dean Galino was called home for a minor emergency which excited no one except Dean Galino. And I gladly offered to share the podium with our speaker tonight. This is another in the faculty lecture series, The Many Faces of Integration. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Leo Kuper, professor of sociology at UCLA. His education began at the University of Witwatersrand, where he first received the baccalaureate with honors in English, took a degree in law, and finally at the University of Birmingham in 1952 received the PhD in sociology. He has served the University of Birmingham as lecturer, has been chairman of the Department of Sociology and Social Work, and dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Natal. Currently, he holds the position professor of sociology at UCLA. Among his writings are the books Blueprint for Living Together in Towns, Passive Resistance in South Africa, with Watts and Davies, Durban, A Study in Racial Ecology, and most recently a satirical novel about the new African colleges, The College Brew, published in 1961. His research is active in the fields of town planning, race relations, and African sociology. The title of this evening's lecture is The Problem of Integration Today, Violent or Passive Resistance. I am honored to introduce to you Professor Leo Kuper.
Thank you very much for your introduction, Mr. Frankel. My topic is the problem of integration today, violence or passive resistance. And I think, first of all, I would like to say something about the term passive resistance, and then consider different types of resistance campaigns, and then ask whether they are in fact integrative. And I should say, first of all, that the term passive resistance is not acceptable to people involved in the resistance movements. It seems to imply that the initiative actually comes from someone else, and that one then passively resists this initiative. It seems to imply weakness. It seems to imply inaction, an omission to do things rather than positive activity. Now, I would think that Mahatma Gandhi actually laid the basis for these different uses of non-violent techniques of political change. And he quite rejected the term passive resistance, which he thought of as an instrument of the weak. He felt that what was involved in passive resistance was the expedient use of non-violence rather than the principled use of non-violence. And he called his own movement satyagraha, which was the insistence on truth. And this then was based on the conviction that violence is sinful under all circumstances. And he then relied on the superior strength of soul force as against body force. So that he thought of satyagraha as an expression of strength. Now this idea was taken over in South Africa. I try and contrast the South African scene with the scene in the United States, both being countries which have used the technique of non-violence. Mahatma Gandhi pioneered this technique in South Africa in the early years of this century, and there's been a continuing use, a continuing tradition of non-violence. It was expressed after the Second World War in a campaign by Indians against racial zoning, and then it was expressed in 1952 in a campaign by Africans and Indians with some slight participation by white people. And this last movement, which is a very active major movement, the participants described as the Defiance of Unjust Laws campaign. So they were giving it a very active, very positive title of defiance. Quite recently, one of the leaders of this movement came to the United States and spoke in Washington. He spoke in Washington in, I think it was April of this year, and I was interested that he went out of his way to make it clear that this resistance campaign of 1952 had been an active, courageous campaign and not simply a weapon of the weak. Here, I suppose one might take Reverend Martin Luther King as a symbol of nonviolent action, though of course the technique of nonviolence goes back much earlier than Luther King's leadership. He describes his position in the Pilgrimage to Nonviolence, and he tells us that earlier he had almost despaired of the power of love to solve social problems. He comments that the turn the other cheek and the love your enemies philosophies are valid, I felt, only when individuals are in conflict with other individuals. When racial groups and nations are in conflict, a more realistic approach is necessary. And this, I think, raises interesting problems. I don't know what one means when one talks about the validity of the turn the other cheek philosophy in personal relationships. I could imagine that it might be valid under certain circumstances, and that in other circumstances it would actually provoke considerable violence, provoke actually greater brutality. But I certainly think that there's a different situation involved when you have groups confronting each other. That it's much more easy to be brutal when groups meet each other, because the individual is not obliged to be brutal. The brutality may be taken over by the police or the courts of law, so that the individual himself feels no particular responsibility. He has no contact with the suffering which is being inflicted. And something of this doubt about the validity of the turn the other cheek philosophy was also expressed by an African leader in relation to Christianity. He said that he could not see how Christianity could offer a solution, since it was addressed to the individual and to individual salvation, whereas what was involved here was the conflict between groups. And how then could religion of individual salvation meet the problem of the conflict between groups? But Reverend King writes that his doubts were dissolved when he was introduced to the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi. And he says that the whole concept of satyagraha, which he translates as truth force or life force, became highly significant to him. He said that he realized that the Christian doctrine of love, operating through the Gandhian method of non-violence, is one of the most potent weapons available to an oppressed people in their struggle for freedom. And in Montgomery, during the bus boycott, he became more and more convinced of the power of non-violence. He says, non-violence became more than a method to which I gave intellectual assent. It became a commitment to a way of life. So we have in Martin Luther King this commitment to this very strong concept of resistance. And I think we may describe King's meaning perhaps in a phrase he himself used when he urged a combination of tender-heartedness with tough-mindedness. And he himself describes his technique as a technique of non-violent, direct action. Now, all these people are addressing Western whites for whom I suppose courage, action, and initiative, and perhaps even violence, are important values. And they were then addressing Western whites in a language which would communicate to them. And they were asserting then that in the use of non-violence, they were displaying great strength and great courage. And I think there can be little doubt of it. One is quite appalled to think of what courage is demanded, say, of a child, of a Negro child who walks into school through a white Southern mob. One thinks of demonstrators. I always sort of feel myself into this situation with some experience of South Africa. One thinks of demonstrators sitting in a bus terminal, and meanwhile an ugly mob gathering outside, and one knows that this means enormous courage and enormous enterprise, which is not conveyed by the term passive resistance. So I will talk instead of non-violent direct action, which is the term used here, and civil disobedience, depending on the type of campaign that's involved. Now, by way of preliminary comment, I should distinguish between different types of movement, because their consequences for integration will be different. We ought to distinguish between resistant movements which are within the framework of the law and resistant movements which are outside of it or involve deliberate civil disobedience. Then one ought to distinguish whether the campaign involves individuals, a few individuals, or whether it involves masses, and whether it works by an attempt to change the heart of people, or whether it works by compulsion or embarrassment or pressure. Mahatma Gandhi himself preferred civil disobedience, the defiance of the law, because he was very much concerned with the central significance of suffering. He thought of the mortification of the flesh as a means to spiritual progress, that self-purification was to be achieved through suffering. In civil disobedience, suffering was guaranteed because one would suffer in prison, and for him then civil disobedience was a synonym for suffering. He described it as a terrifying synonym of suffering. Hence, this belief adds very greatly to the strength of the resistor. He actually courts imprisonment, and when he goes to prison and suffers, he feels strengthened and purified by it. Now, Martin Luther King has taken over this concept of the central role of suffering. In the Strength to Love, he says, if only to save myself from bitterness, I have attempted to see my personal ordeals as an opportunity to transfigure myself and heal the people involved in the tragic situation which now obtains. I've lived these last few years with a conviction that unearned suffering is redemptive. There are some who still find the cross a stumbling block. Others consider it foolishness. But I am more than convinced than ever before that it is the power of God unto social and individual salvation. So like the Apostle Paul, I can now humbly yet proudly say, I bear in my body the marks of the Lord Jesus. Well, this is certainly a very proud claim. One finds the symbolism of the cross and the concept of martyrdom in Chief Albert Luthuli, whom I would take as the South African counterpart of Martin Luther King. But there is a difference here. While Luthuli accepts this concept of martyrdom for the sake of his people and for the sake of greater freedom, he does not see a redemptive role in suffering. And this then, I think, makes his suffering in a way all the more moving, in the sense that he's anxious and troubled about it. This is a speech that he gave when he was asked to resign his chieftainship. Pressure was exerted by the government, and he then decided to become involved in the non-violent campaign for freedom. He wrote that the wisdom or foolishness of this decision I place in the hands of the Almighty. What the future has in store for me I do not know. It might be ridicule, imprisonment, concentration camp, flogging, banishment, even death. Actually, he has not suffered all of these, but he's suffered a good many of them, and of course many of the people who have worked with him have also suffered in this way. I only pray to the Almighty to strengthen my resolve so that none of these grim possibilities may deter me from striving for the sake of the good name of our beloved country, the Union of South Africa, to make it a true democracy and a true union in form and spirit of all the communities in the land. My only painful concern at times is that of the welfare of my family, but I try even in this regard, in a spirit of trust and surrender to God's will as I see it, to say God will provide. It is inevitable that in working for freedom, some individuals and some families must take the lead and suffer. The road to freedom is via the cross. So again, we have this imagery, but with anxiety and not embracing suffering as personally regenerative. Now, I should say that the line, of course, between a civil disobedience campaign and legal forms of resistance cannot be sharply drawn, because the rulers immediately proceed or may proceed to persecute in any event, and they treat perfectly legal action as if it were illegal. I take examples here where resistors are arrested on such pretexts as trespassing or creating a nuisance or conspiracy, or more recently were arrested on grounds of insurrection. The distinction I suggested of movements might also be made in terms of whether they involve an individual or whether they involve masses. And from Gandhi's point of view, the resistance of an individual was sufficient. It was enough that there should be an individual act of suffering, provided it was saintly, it was suffering with dignity and with pure motives. And it is for this reason then that one gets such campaigns, such demonstrations as involved fasting. And here the concept is that other people are moved vicariously by this fasting and suffer a change of heart. Now, this technique has also been used here, and unfortunately I have not been able to see any of the people who fasted here, nor really to know what the effects have been. I would imagine that fasting is meaningful in a society in which there is much starvation, but that in a society which has a great deal of surfeit, and where the appeal is made to the surfeited groups who are interested in low-calorie diets, that fasting itself is relatively meaningless. In any event, it seems to me difficult to know how the individual can translate his suffering in such a way that it moves the masses of people. It can be done, of course, if the media take it up and help to make his suffering a moving experience for others. The more usual is, of course, the mass action, marches, large meetings, days of mourning. I'm not sure to what extent this technique has been used, that actually on the days when the ruling people celebrate, that is the day selected for a day of mourning, and one withholds then moral approval of the system. Or a stay at home where the ruling group depends on the labor of the oppressed people, or an economic boycott, an effective form of mass action. And here it's quite clear that Negroes have an immensely powerful weapon. I don't know what the purchasing power of the Negro population in the United States would be, but I suppose not far off $1,000 million a year. Now here, of course, the mechanism is that of embarrassment, of making the situation uncomfortable, and thus of exerting pressure on the ruling group. Now I'd like to make the issues a little more concrete by analyzing a letter you might know, written by Martin Luther King from Birmingham City Jail in, I think it was April or May of this year. He was replying in April of this year, he was replying to a statement by 8 leading clergymen in Alabama who charged that the movement was led in part by outsiders, that the movement was untimely, and also in effect that it was an incitement to violence. They said that they were now confronted by a series of demonstrations by some of our Negro citizens, directed and led in part by outsiders. And they went on to say that the facing of the issues could best be accomplished by citizens of their own metropolitan area, white and Negro, meeting with their knowledge and experience of the local situation. Now this charge that it's outsiders who are responsible is an exceedingly common one. It seems to be almost a regularity in this type of situation. And I imagine that partly it says that the system is a moral one, that it would be all right if outsiders didn't come and interfere, that the people are quite happy until they're told that they're not happy. It has the implication that if they were left alone, they would settle their own problems quite successfully, that basically the relationships are good. And finally, of course, they express a fear of the outside interference. And this, I think, is quite crucial in the present situation. I cannot imagine that nonviolent action would be at all effective, but for the fact that there is this outside opinion and this outside force and this outside interest. Well, King then points out that he was invited as president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, that he was invited to take part in the demonstrations at Birmingham. And beyond this, he pleads a broad humanism. He says, I am in Birmingham because injustice is here. Just as the 8th century prophets left their little villages and carried their thus saith the Lord far beyond the boundaries of their hometown, and just as the Apostle Paul left his little village of Tarsus and carried the gospel to practically every hamlet, I too am compelled to carry the gospel of freedom. I cannot sit idly by and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. And I find here that in this assertion, it is interesting that it is a Negro pastor who should be asserting the broad values of humanity and the broad humanism in contrast to the parochialism of the letter to which he was replying. And in a sense, to some extent, an important source of democratic ideals in the United States, is to be found in the Negro Revolt, much as an important source of democratic ideas in South Africa is to be found in the African Revolt. King expressed this exceedingly well when he said that one day the South will know that when these disinherited children of God sat down at lunch counters, they were in reality standing up for the best in the American dream and the most sacred values in our Judeo-Christian heritage, and thus carrying our whole nation back to the great wells of democracy which were dug deep by the founding fathers in the formulation of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. But the second charge was that the demonstrations were unwise and untimely, though the white pastors said that they recognized the natural impatience of the people. And here, of course, what is involved is that time has a very different dimension for people who inflict suffering and people who suffer. King says, I guess it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say wait. But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim. Now, if I might just deviate here a moment before I take up his speech, it's always been a little puzzling that in South Africa we don't have lynching, that lynching is an American pattern, not a South African pattern. I used to think that I knew the reason for it, and that was that the laws in South Africa were discriminatory, and the handling of these laws was entrusted to the police, so that the oppressive functions were legally exercised by the police. And it seemed to me that since in the United States you don't have the legal mechanisms for oppression, that therefore you had to rely on illegal mechanisms. But then I see that my picture of the police is not one that Negroes would accept in the United States. King, in fact, goes on to say, when you've seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, brutalize, and even kill your black brothers and sisters with impunity, and there is such complaint that I realize it was naive of me to think that police were necessarily altogether so different in their functions in parts of the United States. And I would assume then that the explanation lies in the frontier tradition in the United States, a direct use of violence, and that there may then be much greater regard for violence in the United States. And presumably the attitude of white Americans to violence will affect their response to non-violent campaigns. But King then continues, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park, and see the depressing clouds of inferiority begin to form in her little mental sky, when you are forever fighting a degenerating sense of nobodiness, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over, and men are no longer willing to be plunged into an abyss of injustice where they experience the bleakness of corroding despair. I was reminded here of a speech by Chief Lutuli, in which much the same sentiment is expressed. Though let me say, I don't think the situation in South Africa at all comparable with the situation in the United States. That in the United States you're moving toward desegregation, whereas in South Africa there's a movement toward increasing segregation and discrimination. In the United States there is the rule of law. Basically, in South Africa there's been virtually an abandonment of the rule of law. But nevertheless, the circumstances which have provoked the non-violent campaigns have many similarities. And Chief Lutuli says that insofar he's reviewing his whole lifetime of moderation and of pleading for rights, and he says insofar as gaining citizenship rights and opportunities for the unfettered development of the African people, who will deny that 30 years of my life have been spent knocking in vain, patiently, moderately, and modestly at a closed and barred door? Well, there clearly comes a time when one feels obliged to take action, when patience is exhausted, when the pace of change is too inordinately slow. The third point raised by the pastors was an interesting one. They said they rejected hatred and violence, that these had no sanction in the American religious and political traditions. But then they went on to say, we also point out that such actions as incite to hatred and violence, however technically peaceful those actions may be, have not contributed to the resolution of our local problem. They are charging, in fact, that non-violence brings violence in its train, that the two cannot be separated. So far as I've been able to see, the campaigns here have been remarkable for their disciplined non-violence. And this, I understand, is in part due to the training people have received. I imagine, too, it would be due also to the influence of the churches. But there has been violence. There's been violence by the police. There's been violence by whites. There's been violence by Negroes. And this has been the same has happened, of course, in India. Mahatma Gandhi sometimes had to call off his campaigns, and the same has happened in South Africa. And I think it may be that to some extent violence is an accompaniment of non-violence. Gandhi thought one got violence because the authorities did not know how to handle non-violence, and they started striking out in all directions, like a child flailing its arms. But in any event, emotions become heightened, and this then would certainly encourage violence. I think then, much in the same way that one can't really draw a clear line between legal and illegal resistance, it's difficult to draw a very sharp line between violence and non-violence. But this is quite a different matter from ascribing responsibility to the resistors. And I think Martin Luther King is quite right when he says, it is immoral to urge an individual to withdraw his efforts to gain his basic constitutional rights because the quest precipitates violence. Are people simply to endure inferiority to the end of time because other people may react with violence to their demands? Now, in all this, I've really taken Reverend Martin Luther King as central, which is probably not a proper balanced approach, because clearly the non-violent direct action precedes Martin Luther King. And I should say something briefly then about the different organizations involved in the civil rights movement. The use of non-violent direct action goes back, so far as I know, to the founding of the Congress of Racial Equality in 1942. And this means then that for a whole generation people have been trying to bring about change by non-violent action. It was formed by Negroes and whites, and it still continues to be interracial. This seems to me to be crucial, because I cannot see how a movement can achieve integration if the movement itself is not integrated. It seems that you need an integrated movement to achieve integration. And this is especially relevant because in South Africa, the main political non-white organizations were organized on racial lines. And one of them, the African National Congress, has as its goal an integrated society. And yet it would seem that the mode of organization and the goal were quite out of keeping. So that this seems to me highly significant, the interracial membership of CORE. It's quite often said that there is a class factor involved in the particular aspects which CORE takes up for demonstration, for protest. CORE has concentrated on freedom rides and on sit-ins. I would imagine that the desegregation of bus terminals would benefit all Negroes, but would especially benefit the middle class. And I would think that the same is true of the desegregation of luncheon counters, that it would benefit all people, but particularly the middle class. And quite apart from this, I'm sure that the campaign itself helps to encourage Negroes and to raise their sentiments of self-assurance. But it seems to me that basically these are points which concern the middle class, and that in this respect there is a middle class emphasis. The American demonstrations did encourage people in South Africa to try sit-in movements, and then mixed contingents would go into a restaurant and sit in and ask to be served. The movement itself did not gain any following in South Africa, and I think the reason for it was this class element that was involved, that most of the people are living at a subsistence level. They don't have freedom of movement, they don't have freedom to seek work, and with this background, it's perhaps not so important whether you can go into a restaurant and be served. Well, the similar type of movement to CORE is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and this I understand to be rather more, I'm feeling for my words, perhaps I put it rather this way, that I understand that they are particularly active in voter registration campaign, which seems to me to be less of a class-stamped type of campaign. I would regard the work of these organizations as complementary in a way to the work of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. That the National Association is opening up the opportunities by its action in the courts, and that these other organizations are giving some substance to what would otherwise remain hollow legal rights. The Urban League, so far as I know, concerns itself mainly with problems of migrant workers, opening up of work opportunities, but is now moving also into the field of voters registration. Now, in all these movements, there's an evolutionary concern with regular constitutional approaches. There's a concern with equality, but also with integration. And I think by way of contrast, one should mention the nationalist type movement. I'm thinking of the Nation of Islam or the black Muslims. And this movement then is ostensibly separatist. I would assume that to the extent that the present movements fail, that the Nation of Islam will grow in strength. Now this movement, I've said, is ostensibly separatist. I don't understand to what extent they really do desire a separate state, or whether it's merely the present despair which makes them express their reaction in this way. I regard them as a movement within Christianity. In other words, my impression is that they don't embrace Islam because of any specific dedication to Islam, but that they embrace Islam because they reject Christianity and they reject the white man, and the movement itself expresses a profound disillusion with the white man. Here in the Nation of Islam, they have then a system of religious beliefs which restores to the Negro his faith in his own personal qualities, in his superiority to the white man. And the Nation of Islam, of course, offers an assurance of compensation in the future in this world with the destruction of the white man. Again, I would suppose, I know something of the polemic here, but I would suppose that the Nation of Islam repudiates violence. In terms of its religious ethic, it would hardly need to embrace violence, because the destruction of the white man will be an act of God and come about in its due time. But the movement is highly exclusive, and I think there's little doubt that it's motivated by a deep hatred of white people. And I would see the exclusiveness and the hatred as elements which go together. I think perhaps I can now answer directly the problem that has been posed, whether nonviolent direct action can be a potent technique for integration. In the first place, I would immediately assume that violence is not a technique for integration, for the following reasons: that it's difficult to attain interracial cooperation by violence. And looking at the experience in South Africa, the resistance movements are interracial. The present turn to violence takes two forms, one of sabotage and one of terrorism. The interracial cooperation, to the best of my knowledge, is only found in the sabotage movement. In other words, white people are prepared to act with non-white people in the destruction of property, but not in attacks on the lives of fellow white people. And I would suppose that as violence increases, interracial cooperation would grow more and more difficult. I cannot see the goal of racial integration being achieved by these means unless racial integration is achieved in the actual struggle itself. Then I assume that violence and race hatred go together, that in order to be violent you have to have a good deal of race hatred, and that when you are actually engaged in violence, the acts of violence give rise to race hatred. There are some people who will tell you that they believe in the therapy of what they describe as a little racial bloodletting, and this is not my point of view at all. I think it's a detached, highly removed point of view. Now, if the problem were one of reduction of discrimination rather than that of integration, I would find it more difficult to answer. It might be that violence would bring an end to discrimination more quickly, and this certainly seems to be the conclusion in a different situation that Africans have come to. Africans in South Africa compare the negative results of their long campaign of non-violence with the results in Kenya, where following on Mau Mau, there's been a rapid movement to independence. But since the question is integration, I have personally no doubt that violence would not be an effective technique. If integration is to be achieved, I would suppose that the only solution is that along which the Negro organizations or the interracial organizations are at present working, that it requires non-violent direct action of massive dimensions and strategically directed. I think if Negroes and other persons interested did nothing at all, the position would stagnate. I do not think they can leave it to their white friends to bring about integration. And in any event, it's the paternalism, white paternalism, that is being rejected. I have heard Negroes say that every major advance is something for which they have had to fight themselves. This I can't evaluate, but certainly they've had to fight very hard for some of the advances they've made. Now, I'm speaking entirely as a stranger to American society, trying to get some impression of it. It's quite obvious to me that there's very extreme racial prejudice of a violent sort in the South. It hardly needs sociologists to be aware of it. But I would assume also that there's a great deal of racial prejudice in the North. I cannot imagine that the discrimination would have persisted for so long unless there were this racial prejudice and this tacit support. And it seems to me that the racial prejudice is masked by an indifference, and that as pressure is exerted, the indifference begins to show itself in racial prejudice, but conversely, other people move closer toward integration. And I think if I were a Negro in the United States, I would really be almost in a state of despair, looking at the great mass of power which is ranged against one, the enormous complexity, the enormous difference between the verbal professions and the actual practice. I knew that I was going to talk here, and I knew it was very crucial for me to follow the Civil Rights Bill in the Congress. Everything that I can read on it, I read about it, but I simply cannot make out. I can make neither head nor tail of what is happening to the Civil Rights Bill. But what I know is the whole thing moves into a highly complex political process, that now it's in the hands of skilled politicians. And the feeling, I would imagine, is something like Agamemnon must have felt when the net was thrown over him. And I would think then that in nonviolent direct action, there is a technique which creates such tension that indifference is no longer possible. It may divide people so that some are more opposed or more openly opposed than they were and bring over other people, but it seems to me that this is an inevitable process in the movement toward integration. I think if there is to be integration, then Negroes must exercise fear and a feeling of inferiority, and it seems to me that these campaigns bring about these sentiments, and that many Negroes have gained great spiritual strength and stature in these campaigns. I would not expect any significant result from deliberate acts of suffering in the Gandhi tradition. Again, I'm guessing at American white society, but I think American whites are uncomfortable with the idea of suffering, that much of the American experiment is really to try and get rid of suffering, to banish suffering, even so far as I can see, to transform death into a sort of embalmed continuation of life, so that there's no longer suffering. I think that the campaigns must not be directed so much to a change of heart as to embarrass by the use of what was described as a spirit of creative dislocation. And I would assume that power has to be applied, particularly in the use of the vote, and, if necessary, in the use of the purchasing power of Negroes. Now, I'm not unmindful that the tensions could lead to violence. And I'm also very mindful of the fact that continued frustration could lead to violence. In South Africa, the failure of the non-violent campaigns has led to the conviction that the only means of change is violence. But then the solution, the avoidance of violence, really lies with white Americans. The solution lies with white Americans to join with American Negroes in creating an integrated society which would be free from the scars and mutilations of racial oppression. Thank you.
Dr. Kuper has consented to answer any questions that may come from the floor. I'm sure I don't have to remind you that it is questions, not speeches, that we seek. Sir?
Dr. Kuper, I've heard expressed by Negro leaders in the South who have just become disillusioned with nonviolence, who felt that the making appeal of nonviolence is in a situation where there's a discrepancy between the enunciated ethic and the practice. And he felt that in the North, where this enunciated ethic is accepted by most people, the ethic of racial
Yes, I think I would say.
Do you agree with this idea?
No, I'd like to tell you why I don't agree with that, because I think the concept of the society is too narrow. It seems to me that this was the important point that Martin Luther King was making, that it's not a matter of the South being simply bounded by its own boundaries. It belongs to a wider world. Now, what the position would be if the South were entirely isolated, say a position more comparable to South Africa, I don't know. I think the way in which the white Southerners handled the Negroes would probably be very frightening and very tyrannical in every respect, perhaps like the South African situation. But the white South is not isolated. It belongs to the United States. That a movement in the South activates people outside. It activates the federal government. It activates opinion in the United States. It activates opinion in the United Nations. It activates the tribunals of conscience represented by world councils of churches, so that though within the South the response might have been brutal, the fact that the South belongs within a wider world means that the demonstrations can be highly effective. And I think perhaps in a way that what is most necessary is that these demonstrations should be sufficient to activate movements outside the South. So I certainly would not agree with the point of view you've expressed by way of question.
In other words, you think the changes in the South are going to come about only by pressure from without, only by pressure from the federal power structure or by nationwide groups, and not because of any change in ideology or as either change in the hearts of white Southerners?
Well, I would imagine that there are people in the South who are whites in the South who are quite opposed to the system of race relations and would like to see a change and could express themselves more effectively with support from the outside. And I would imagine that people in the South who are perhaps committed to segregation, as they see the forces ranged against this point of view, not merely physical but spiritual forces ranged against it, will also begin to change. I'm merely saying that it's too limiting to think of the South as a self-enclosed world.
The fact that the national administration really is not interested in the moral principle involved in the Negro situation, but is going as far as political expediency demands it, and that because of that, it is compelling the Negro desperately to move towards violence instead of continuing the road of nonviolence.
And did you hear the question? Yes, well, the question was really whether the administration, the attitude of the administration, whether it was not simply governed by political expediency, not really guided by principle, but just going as far as politically expedient to go.
And forcing the issue of the Negro into the violent struggle, because the Negro administration is only going, the national administration is only moving just a few steps at a time in 100 years.
Yes, I think I've said that I'm quite bewildered by the political process here, and that I have found this movement very disappointing, and that I can imagine it would be deeply frustrating to Negroes. I can't really say more except that I would expect that continued frustration would clearly increase the danger of violence. Yes.
I wonder if you could generalize from your experience in South Africa, coming of apartheid after the Second World War, or the increase of it. Speculate on what might happen in this country if Barry Goldwater were elected.
I think, I'm always game to have a shot, but I like to have an informed, an informed shot. I think that there are limitations on what Barry Goldwater or any American politician could do, and those limitations are the sort of opinions that are expressed in the United Nations and that are expressed in world opinion, and it doesn't seem to me that the United States could possibly move in a direction of increased oppression, which I take it to be the implication of your reference to the politician in question. Yeah.
Question here, sir.
Yes.
Contrary to a previous questioner, do you not think that it is more reasonable and more objective to hold that the President is truly interested in integration and racial equality, but that the poor man is walking a tightrope, and if he goes just an inch too far toward integration, the Republicans and the Dixiecrats will sabotage his whole program. So the man has to proceed by centimeters where he would like to go by feet and yards, because he is hands are tied by the partisans in Congress. Do you agree with that?
Well, you know, I really I don't know, in the sense that I don't know the politicians here at all, but I take it that in effect you're saying the same as this questioner asked.
Exactly the opposite.
No, but aren't you really saying that he would like to go the whole distance, but because of political considerations, expedient considerations, he does not go? And I take it that what you said was that he is governed by political expediency and hence does not. Now, I may be not being very subtle, but it doesn't seem to me that the two of you are saying such very different things, but you're expressing your admiration for the President, I take it, and the first speaker. But I don't think you were at such yes. Are you going to take me out of these dilemmas into some place where I can answer intelligently?
There's one aspect of passive resistance that I don't quite understand, and I'd just like to know how passive resistance would better the Negro's economic situation, other than his having the right to go into a store, down at the counter, this and that. What direct bearing does it have on his skills, on his ability to get a job?
Yes, I suppose there are two aspects here. One is the question of opening up the positions, and presumably then non-violent direct action helps to open up the positions. To take the most obvious and crude case, an economic boycott directed against a particular firm which does not employ Negroes. That would be an obvious case. And the other question is the acquisition of the necessary skills to hold these jobs, which would of course go back to the educational system and inequalities also in the educational system. A non-violent direct action then would be opening up the educational opportunities. Am I replying to you? No, this I'm not completely certain about. I understood your question, I take it. Yes.
How does the question of Negro creation in the South of the United States affect the sociological concept of the church outside? Because it seems to me that the white man in the South is doing a lot of the evangelical work in Africa, in all parts of the world. How does those actions in the South of the United States affect the church?
Yes, I don't really know that church work there's somebody here in the audience, I think, who knows a great deal more about it than I do, but I don't think the church work is specifically linked with the United States. But I think what is happening is that among many Africans, there is a rejection of the United States because of the internal policies, and that this also expresses itself as a turning toward Russia rather than the United States. There is a feeling among many Africans that the United States goes along with discrimination and with such systems as apartheid. But I don't, not, so far as I know, this is not expressed in the idiom of the churches. I wonder if anyone else could take this up, whether it affects the religious observance. I can merely tell you in South Africa, one of the important American churches was the American Board Mission, and their mission work was really quite remarkable because they pioneered advance for Africans in education, in training as nurses, in control over their schools, control over the congregations, and there certainly their behavior was such as to inspire a good deal of confidence. Yes. It's got a double point to it. I'm sorry, I didn't get your starting point. How can the Negro educational system can be such that it hardly trains one to exercise the vote very responsibly? So I wouldn't feel that because people are not well educated, that therefore they're not competent to select representatives wisely. Yes. I would suppose that non-violence could have been effective in Kenya. I've forgotten the ratio of population, but it must have been an overwhelming majority of Africans, and I imagine that if they'd have withdrawn cooperation, organized an effective non-violent direct action, that the position would have been quite untenable. I would think they could have achieved their goals not violently. Yes.
My question is more a theoretical question in reference to your earlier remarks on the nature of nonviolence. And would you say that nonviolence is more or less closely related to violence because, well, as we all well know, that it often is followed by violence, in that it confronts a social situation static and more or less immobile, and it forces it either to repress the force, because nonviolence is a force, either towards a change or repression, and this repression is violence, and that is you get your way or else you're repressed. So that violence in most cases is a concomitant or surrounding the nonviolent action.
Violent action could be handled by the authorities non-violently in such a way as to make the movement ineffective. I remember on one occasion when Africans were wanting to be arrested. It was important that they should be arrested because this was the form of the campaign. So they refused to carry their curfew documents. Then they invited policemen to arrest them, and the police did not arrest them. They paraded outside the police station, and the police did not arrest them. In other words, the movement in the first instance was frustrated by the refusal of the police to inflict suffering. In the end, of course, the police had to arrest them because otherwise everyone would have stopped carrying the curfew passes and the system would have been at an end. But I think that to some extent it does,
This reinforces, in a sense, what I said, because it failed because they did not incite violence. I mean, it has to bring about violence to succeed, and to a certain degree, but not total chaos. But it has to dramatize the situation in more or less complete war violence, to dramatize in a more coherent fashion rather than, the indifference.
Well, I suppose in a way these resistance movements arise in societies which exercise a great deal of force. There's a great readiness to exercise force, and the non-violence movement threatens the established privilege, and the natural reaction is one of force. I would also think in the heightening of emotions, the gathering together. The type of violent action I know is where many Africans, for example, come together, having demonstration of some sort. The police give them 5 minutes to disperse, probably charge them before the 5 minutes are up, or maybe charge into them at the end of the 5 minutes. Then they act violently, inflict violence, and provoke a violent reaction. You're wanting something more than this, are you? I like to satisfy people if I can. Yes.
I just comment on your remarks concerning the failure of the hunger strike or fasting strike in this country. Isn't there a rather marked difference between an anonymous corps member sitting in the Board of Education of Los Angeles fasting and Mahatma Gandhi, who was the recognized spiritual leader on the 5th or 4th million nations, fasting pretty equivalent for his time?
Really, what you're suggesting is that what was effective was not the purity of his fast at all, but the fact that it was Mahatma Gandhi. Yes, I would think that this is a crucial point which I would have done well to mention. But nevertheless, I think that people who do fast, the anonymous core members, are thinking that their demonstration that they're prepared to undergo such immense suffering would evoke a sympathetic response. I just don't know whether it did here at all.
I think we have time for just one more question.
Yes.
You mentioned that at the beginning of organized civil rights movement, starting with the war in 1942, and that it benefited the middle class. I was wondering what historically would be effects of the ongoing context of the 1954, 12 years later, there was a Supreme Court decision, and again, none of that again much until the early 60s. In other words, what group did it appeal to, and how did it somehow diffuse?
Did you? I think the question really is that course started in 1942. It took 12 years before there was the Supreme Court decision. Your question is really why this didn't achieve more, is it?
Yes, and why did it begin in 42? It's really a historical question in terms of...
Yes, I don't know the explanation for that. What I have read was quite simply that people got together, they found that the legal techniques in AACP had started in 1910, that they didn't think that the legal techniques were effective, and they felt the need then for the testing of legal decisions. I think their first campaign in 1947 was a decision about interstate travel. They wanted to test the extent to which the states were implementing the decision of the Supreme Court, and I think they felt then that a legal decision could remain without any substance. I would assume it's the whole development of the greater advance of Negroes, the effect of the Second World War, of the movement to the cities of the North, and so on.
series will continue next week when Professor Van Alstyne of the Law School will address himself to legal matters. See you then.